Okay, a couple of housekeeping items. Just a reminder, please send me your exam schedule as soon as possible. Thanks to those of you who did. I'm waiting on 5 of them. So as soon as I hear from those remaining 5, I can put it all together and we can figure out when to schedule the exam. Other item on the agenda, well, housekeeping item anyway, lots of else. Questions regarding the assignment? Again, don't hesitate. I haven't heard any questions yet, which is okay. If I made it so clear that you have absolutely 0 questions, I'll be amazed but very pleased. But again, don't hesitate to ask questions, email, stop by, whatever works. Okay, so today we move from Unit 1, Secondary Sources, to Unit 2, which is most of the semester, really, primary sources. So I always think of secondary sources as stuff to help me find the law. Technical term there, stuff. And then, of course, now we need to look at the law. And, of course, as lawyers, we must read and interpret the law. That's what you're spending these 3 years learning how to do. So we are going to look at where to find the law. And some of the research tools that hopefully will make it easier. So we're going to start with a little bit of review using the handout sources of the law with a nice little green picture of New York. And I realize that you learned this probably way back in 9th or 10th grade, whenever you took civics, or at least some of this, and then reviewed it again briefly in con law before you dove into far more complex matters. But I'm going to look at it from the lens of course, legal research and where you find these materials. I put together this chart. As you can see, there's a lot crammed in there. It is my very strong belief that if you understand the content of this chart, you are about 50% the way there to understanding, researching primary law. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time here. Hopefully it will help make sense for you in terms, again, of looking at this primary law with regard to research. So the columns. So the first column, as you can see, is a description. So just describing what we're going to be looking at in the other 2 columns. The next middle column, of course, is federal jurisdiction. And the right-hand column is New York. And we'll talk about states generally, but mostly New York, since most of you will be staying in New York from what you told me. We will be looking at New York in depth, coming back to this chart next week. So I'm going to put that column aside for today. So we will be focusing on the first 2 columns. Okay, so that first line as we go down the chart under description, what establishes our structure of government? And of course in the federal realm, U.S. Constitution, we all know that, pretty straightforward. So within the Constitution, we have, of course, the 3 branches, and that's what is the remainder of that first column. Under description, of course, the Article 1 legislative branch. From the federal end, of course, Congress, House and Senate. We'll be coming back to those 2 boxes, the federal boxes, in just a few minutes. But moving down, just so we put everything in the larger perspective before we dive deep into the particulars, we have, of course, the executive branch. Of course, in the federal realm, the president, and the president manages the various agencies. And we'll be talking about, and the agencies promulgate regulations, and we'll be talking in detail about administrative law again later in the semester. And of course, as we all have heard a lot about in the news, the president also issues executive orders. And we'll be talking a lot about executive orders later on in the semester. I know it's a hot topic now, so hold on there, we'll get there. And then, of course, finally, Article 3, the judiciary. And of course, you all are very familiar with cases, and again, we'll be talking about that later on. So let's dive back to the legislative branch, because the first stop in our look in primary sources is going to be statutes, as you saw in our screencast. I hope that started to make sense for you. We're going to go over most of what we covered in the screencast today. Okay, so let's start with the legislature. As we said, the Congress. So let's look at federal today and again states next week. So of course, the legislative branch, Congress, is made up of Congress, the House and Senate. And what they do, of course, is vote on pieces of legislation. And when they vote and both houses pass, and then that goes to the president and the president signs it, it becomes a law. So as you can see in the first column under legislative, it talks about the session law enacted by the legislature. And as you saw in the screencast, a session law is just a generic term for the law passed by the legislature, signed by the executive. There are different names for it. In the federal jurisdiction, of course, the name is the public law. And of course, that was the hero of our screencast. Session laws, public laws in the federal world are organized chronologically. Of course, they're passed chronologically. You have the first one that's passed in a session, and then the second and third and fourth, and we'll talk about the numbering in just a moment. So remember that session laws, public laws are passed and then organized in their sources, again, which we'll talk about chronologically. And actually, let's talk about it. So in federal, those public laws, also known as session laws, appear in statutes at large and another set called USCAN. Again, you saw them briefly in the screencast. We will be looking at those in detail today. Okay, so again, public laws in statutes at large, in USCAN, organized chronologically. One of you in your questions in the screencast was a little bit confused about that. I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was, but whoever you are, make sure you understand it by the end of today. If you don't, please ask and help me work with you to clarify it for you and for everybody. Okay. So those public laws are assigned a number. So I'm here at congress.gov, which is a free website, where we can see the first three laws in the 115th Congress. Now, remember again from our screencast, Congresses are numbered starting from way back in 1789 with the first Congress. They last 2 years because the House of Representatives is elected for 2 years. So the first year of a Congress is going to be the first session, and the second year, the second session. So here in the 115th Congress, which just started last month, we have the first session. In 2018, starting January, we'll have the second session. Don't worry too much about the sessions. You'll see that referenced. It really isn't that useful a piece of information. What is totally useful and absolutely critical is the public law number. In fact, I like to refer to it as the all-important public law number, and you'll understand why over the course of the next few weeks. So back here in our listing of public laws, again, 115th Congress started last month. We can see that actually Congress passed and the President signed 3 measures, 3 pieces of legislation, now public laws. So our number, 115, the first number, tells us the Congress. And we can look at this chart for older Congresses to see what years they happened. So obviously we know 115, been talking about that. Started last month. If we scroll down, we'll notice that 93rd Congress started in 1973 and ended at the end of 1974. And of course, 93-406 is the public law number that we'll be talking about. So that's why I point out 93. So again, so someone had asked, again, a very good question, what's the second number? The first number we know is the Congress. What's the second number? Well, the second number is just the order in which that public law was passed and signed by the President. So here's the very first public law that was passed by Congress, signed by the President in the 115th Congress. Here's the second. Here's the third. And that's as far as we've gotten so far in this Congress, to give you a sense of what that might look like for a prior Congress. So here's the 114th Congress, so the one that ended in just this past December. And you can see that there were a grand total of 329 laws that were passed in the 114th Congress. And they're organized in reverse order here. Make sense? The numbering makes sense? It will be really useful for you to understand that numbering, as you will see as we go through today. Okay. So continuing to look back at the sources of the law to finish the overview of the legislative branch. So what happens is those public laws then get arranged by subject and put in the U.S. Code. So we see in the first column under legislative, subject compilation of legislation currently in force equals code. So the U.S., the code, whether it's U.S. or state, again, we'll focus on the U.S. So the U.S. Code does two things for us. First, it organizes it by subject. So we're usually looking for the laws in a particular area, like labor law, like employee benefits, like healthcare. So it's useful to have it in a subject arrangement rather than just randomly numbered by the order passed, which is what how public laws are numbered. And the second critical thing that the U.S. Code does for us is it tells us what laws are currently in force today, or as of the date of that U.S. Code. So if you think about it, looking at this list of public laws from the 114th Congress, there are 329. How do I know that all of that material, all those 329 laws are still in force? Do I want to have to look through all of them and then carry it through to see if anything has been changed? I mean, maybe they, in 114-1, back a couple of years ago, maybe they changed their minds and amended it. Or, more likely, maybe way back in the 93rd Congress, right? The 93rd Congress we saw was back in 73 and 74. And it does go down that far. So there were 649 laws passed in the 93rd Congress. Probably some of those have been changed since 1974, right? You don't want to have to try to go through every single public law since 1974 to see if it's changed. That's what the U.S. Code does for us. It tells us what's currently in force today. A number of you in the questions in the screencast got a little bit confused and thought that public laws tell us what the law is currently today. They don't. The public law tells you what the law is as of the date of that public law. That public law and all the other public laws can get amended and amended and amended. And as we will see with the public law we're going to look at, 93-406, it was amended a bunch of times since 1974. So public laws tell you what the law is as of the date of that public law for that particular issue. The U.S. Code tells you what the law is today, at least the current one. So let's look in a little more detail in our chart, and we see we have a story. As you can tell, I kind of like stories. We had a story in our screencast, and now we have the story written out here. And that story is going to correspond with this handout. This handout is what we call a walkthrough. These are pages from the books. In the past, students have told me that it's useful to be able to see the pages close up and be able to take them home with you rather than sometimes difficult to read the text on the screen. We'll have a few of these in the next few weeks. I will be interested on your thoughts on that question because I don't want to kill trees if I don't have to. So that is what we have, and just to give you a little explanation, the other handout I gave you, which is 13 new, that is the new version of page 13 from the walkthrough handout, and the reason for that is I discovered a more up-to-date version in PDF after I put all this together. So at the break, I have a stapler. If you want to staple in the new page 13, which is what I did on mine, you are welcome to do so. Okay, so our story, federal statutes, or the story of how a federal law is published. Once upon a time, the galaxy far, no, we won't go down that one again. Okay, so as we said, President signs a piece of legislation. There are a couple of other ways that legislation can become law, pocket veto, etc. We won't go into those details, not really necessary for our purposes. We talked about the public law numbering in our story. And we took a look at the listing of public law, the public laws from the 115th Congress that just started and from the 114th Congress, and of course here in the not right now, we have up there the 93rd. You will see, as I have on the handout here, public law is abbreviated PL. One thing I have discovered about legal research that I actually tell first years is that sometimes half your battle is figuring out what on earth the abbreviation means. I mean, I don't know if you remember way back when you were first years and you saw FSUP and thought, what the heck is that? But now, of course, it's second nature and you don't even think about it. So same is going to be true for some of the statutory materials we look at, especially as we start to move into legislative history. So I will point out those abbreviations as we go if I think they might be a little confusing. Okay, so we talked about public laws live in on the planets of, if you'll allow me to refer back, statutes at large and use scan. So let's take a look at our walkthrough. And you saw some of this already in the screencast. So on the first page is the title page of the Statutes at Large from Volume 88, Part 1. So we are focusing in on ERISA. Because if you might remember, we got that reference from our secondary sources. So as you saw, let's get the right volume out, little show and tell here. You saw again in the screencast, but now you'll actually get to see it in up close and personal. Here is the statutes at large. Here's what it looks like in real life, and I tabbed for you the page that 93406, our public law exists. And again, statutes at large is organized chronologically. It's identified, as you can see, by the volume number 88, but when you look at the book, you'll see it's dated 1974. So start that around this side. If you're interested, take a look. If you're not, just pass it along. Okay, so title page. Let's take a look and actually look at the statute at large, which again you saw briefly in the screencast, but now we're going to take a far more in-depth look. And I actually have part of the Public Law 93406 in a PDF here, if you want to see up on the screen. Okay, so as we saw in the screencast, here's 93406. So all I did is I went into the statute at large and turned to the first page. So a public law will be cited to in the statutes at large, the way we're all used to legal citations. First the volume, 88, then the abbreviation STAT, statutes at large, and then the page where it starts, 829, as you can see here on the handout. You see the date, you see the public law number. What you see also here is a reference to 29 U.S.C. 1001. And this is where you will find ERISA in the U.S. Code, at least as of 1974. We'll have to move forward to see where we find it today, but sometimes it's the same place. Sometimes, obviously, it could get changed, repealed, it could get renumbered. But this is one way to figure out where do I find ERISA in the code, understanding I'm looking at it from 1974. It may have changed, but maybe not. Okay, also looking at our hero, the public law, we see on our handout on page 2 something called Title I. Title I is essentially within a public law. Title I is just a subject area of that public law. Some public laws are pretty brief and cover one specific subject. Some public laws are really broad and cover a whole bunch of different subjects. So some public laws don't only have one title, or they don't even name it because it's just that one area of law. Other public laws like ERISA have several titles. So we're looking at the Title I, the subject area of the public law of this act, and the first title, the first subject area, as you can see, is Protection of Employee Benefit Rights. And then we see the table of contents, so we see the listing of the sections. So turning to page 3, we see the listing of the sections. Continue in the table of contents, and I am highlighting section 514, something called Effect on Other Laws. And I'm just highlighting that for you now in the table of contents. You'll know why soon. So Title I is Protection of Employee Rights, so that's one subject area. The next subject area in our public law is Title II, a different subject area, amendments to the Internal Revenue Code relating to retirement plans. So can anybody guess? Does anybody know where amendments or where sections of the Internal Revenue Code appear in the U.S. Code?
26.
Title 26. Okay, it's a little bit confusing, the use of the word title. And I can't make it less, well, I can explain it to you, but you're still going to see that use of the word title in two different contexts, and you're just going to have to think to yourself, are we talking about a title within a public law, so a subject area or a subsection within a public law, or are we talking about the title of the entire U.S. Code? They use the same word. I can't change that, but as I said, I hopefully can explain it to you. There's two different contexts, so just think, are we talking about public law, or are we talking about the U.S. Code? And usually within the context, you'll be able to answer that. Questions? Okay, so let's go to page 3. And we see the end of the table of contents. I skipped a few pages. I didn't want to kill that many trees. And now finally we get to the text of Public Law 93-406, our Act ERISA. And here we see Section 2. Section 1 is just, this act shall be called ERISA. So Section 2 of the Public Law we see is findings and declaration of policy. Now, I will talk, when we talk about legislative history, why that kind of section about policy might be interesting. For now, just accept that that's Section 2. And also notice in the left-hand margin, Statutes at Large is telling us you're going to find this Section 2 of Public Law 93-406 in Title 29 of the U.S. Code, Section 1001. Yeah, question.
They sent that out as they're drafting. Like when the public law comes out, they assign where the USC is going to appear.
It depends on the particular public law. As we'll see in a couple of minutes, sometimes when they're amending already existing sections in the public law, it'll say, we're amending this section of the U.S. Code. If it's a brand new section, they might not set forth. By the time it gets published in the Statutes at Large, the whatever office it is in the House of, in Congress that figures all this out has figured it out, so you see it in the Statutes at Large.
But they're not going back and like annotating on the side later on, like, oh, it's going to here. Here's this section. That's done at the outset.
I'm not quite sure what it is you're. I mean, I see what
like
you're.
29 USC 1001. That's already done, like, when they're making the public law, it's not actually out in the U.S. Code yet, right?
Right. I don't think Congress worries about the section number, the actual number of the new section. Congress might worry about the section, as I said, if they're amending an existing section, then they'll say, hey, we want to amend this section. But if they're creating a new section, which is what they did in 1974 for some part of ERISA, then I don't think Congress assigns it. I think when the public law is put together and the Statutes at Large is published, by that time, whatever office figures out the numbering of the U.S. Code has figured that out and put that in as an assistance for all of us. Does that answer? Okay, good. Okay, let's take a quick look at that page 13, the new page that I put separately. Just to sort of reinforce the difference between the titles of a public law and the titles of the U.S. Code. So the titles of the public law, again, the subject area that the public law covers, so sort of the subsections of the public law. And here we see a listing of the titles of the U.S. Code. So we can see, for instance, that reference to Title 29 of the U.S. Code is the labor title. Kind of makes sense, right? Employee benefits come under labor. As Bill already told us, Title 26, the Internal Revenue Code. In the screencast, I pointed out Title 18, Crimes and Criminal Procedure. You don't need me to read all of these. Just get a sense that these titles in the U.S. Code are overall subject areas where the code puts in the statute sections of that particular subject. Okay, so let's go to page 5. So we saw Section 2 of Public Law 93-406. Now Section 3 of 93-406. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through every section. But section 3 is worth highlighting because it's definitions. Law, of course, is words. And if Congress is saying to us, here are particular words that we think are important, here's what they mean, you better know about it. Because if these are statutorily defined, then that's what they mean. So you always want to keep your eyes open for definition sections. So here in Public Law 93-406, Section 3 tells us definitions for the purposes of this title. So for purposes of the title within the public law, Title 1, here are definitions. And again, we have that nice parenthetical that they put in afterwards for us, telling us, oh, and by the way, in the U.S. Code, you will find Section 3 of Public Law 93-406 in Title 29 of the U.S. Code. Again, the labor title hopefully makes sense. Section 1002. Okay. Turning to page 6. Again, I wanted to point out that Section 514, that other laws, effect on other laws, turns out it's a section that we've had reference to. You may remember that effect on other laws, whatever that means, actually turns out you will find Section 514 of Public Law 93-406, and yes, I'm repeating myself intentionally. You'll find Section 514 of 93-406 in Title 29, in the Labor Title U.S. Code, Section 1144. If you might remember, we got that reference from a couple of the secondary sources we looked at with regard to ERISA preemption. Does that ring a bell for anybody? Maybe. I'll show you where we saw it in a little bit. Okay. Let's turn the page to page 7. So that was Title 1 of Public Law 93-406, Protection of Employee Rights. Title 2, another subject area of Public Law 93-406, is, as we saw in the table of contents, amendments to the Internal Revenue Code. And sure enough, as Bill told us, amendments to the Internal Revenue Code are going to wind up in Title 26 of the U.S. Code because they're Internal Revenue Code sections. And as you will see, Joe, in the section 1001, see under Subtitle A, Part 1, Participation Vesting, then you see Section 1011, Section 1011 is Minimum Participation Standards. That's the section of the public law, Section 1011. And what Section 1011 is telling us is this particular part of the Internal Revenue Code is amended by adding at the end thereof the following. And sections 410, 411, 412, 413 through 415, these are all sections of the Internal Revenue Code in Title 26. And you can see actually in the margin, that little margin note, Title 26 U.S.C. 410. And that's one of the new sections that Title II of ERISA added back in 1974. We'd have to go look at the code today to see if it still exists and in what form. So what I am hoping you're starting to see is that the section numbers of the public law are totally different than the section numbers where they wind up in the U.S. Code. Okay, so briefly, because someone mentioned they were a little bit confused about how public laws and statutes at large and USCAN all relate to one another. Public laws appear in statutes at large, which we just spent some amount of time looking at. Public law, and that's the official source, statutes at large, for those of you journal people who love official sources. Public laws, be careful, public laws also appear in an unofficial source called USCAN. USCAN comes out a whole lot quicker than statutes at large because it's a commercial company that's charging libraries and law firms a whole lot of money for this, or at least they used to back in the print days. So USCAN used to be a good place to go for the more current stuff. So USCAN just to make life interesting for you, USCAN looks rather like the statutes at large. Back in the print days, you had to be careful what you were looking at because they were the same colors. I don't know if they did that on purpose or not. But here's what USCAN looked like. You saw it on the screencast. I'll start on your side next go round. So here's what the title page of USCAN. USCAN notice doesn't have volume numbers. So you'll find USCAN. You'll find public laws in USCAN by the year. So you've got 1974 volume, and then you'd find our public law 93-406 if that's what you were interested in doing. Again, ERISA as it existed in 1974. It looks just the same as you will see on the following page, in which should be page 9, but the number got cut off. And again, the main reason I even tell you about USCAN is you will see that reference sometimes in cases. Judges cite to USCAN. Occasionally in secondary sources, you'll see citations to USCAN, so you now know part of what it is. USCAN does some legislative history stuff, which we'll talk about when we talk about legislative history. And just quickly through pages 10, just showing you the same things in USCAN, the public law that's in statutes at large. So you see the table of contents, you see our section 514. Page 11, you see the start of the actual text with section 2 of Title I, Protection of Employee Benefit Rights. Again, same exact section, findings, declaration of policy. And then on page 12, we see the actual text of our section 514. So this is the 1974 volume of USCAN. In later volumes, you will sometimes see in the margin references to where you'll find these sections in the U.S. Code, just like we did in statutes at large. But for some reason, back in 1974, they didn't do it. Okay. So that is our story so far. Public laws up here. Statutes at large, USCAN. The numbering system. So to make sure we are all understanding, what I'm going to try is something a little different in terms of a workshop, a quickie workshop. And what I'll ask you to do is go to TWEN, sign into TWEN and the course website. And then click on Review Questions. So I know they're out of order. If you look at the screen, it goes 1, 2, 5, 6. TWEN doesn't allow me to reorder them, which is a little frustrating. So bear with me and just go slowly so you don't wind up clicking on a different number than we're looking at. Sorry about that. I spent a good hour trying to figure out a way around it, and it just doesn't happen. So when you get there, click on question 1. And so I'm going to ask you to answer the question on your laptop, and then we'll look at the answers together and what everybody said and talk about it if there's any confusion. So the generic name for a public law is a session law. True or false? And look up when you're done.
On the sidebar, it should say customized fully.
No, it should say review questions.
Oh, okay.
I know that's confusing. I may change the name back. So we're doing question 1 under review questions. Everybody done? So let's see if this is going to work. View results. So 15 said true. 4 said false, and just for fun, see a colorful bar graph. I don't know if that tells us much, but why not? Okay, so the generic name for a public law is a session law. Majority is absolutely right. For the 4 of you who are a little bit confused and the 1 of you who decided not to answer, just to make sure you understand. Again, session law is a generic word for law passed by the legislature, signed by the executive. In the federal world, it's called a public law. We'll talk about what it's called in the various states next week. Not every single state, but states have different names for it. Here in New York, just as a preview, we call it a chapter law. Some states call them public acts. Other states have other names. But again, the generic name is session law. Federal name is public law. Okay, let's go back and try question 2. Again, question 2 is in the right order. Okay, so Public Law 111-148 was passed in which Congress? Okay. Wave at me when you're done. Mostly waves. Hello back. Okay, so you're in. Good. View results. Oh, we got everybody voting. Excellent. Okay, again, well done, majority. Again, for whoever might be confused, and that's why we're doing this. So again, the public law, first number is the Congress number. Remember, Congress lasts 2 years, so it's the 111th Congress. And the second number is just the order in which the laws were passed. So this was the 148th law passed in the 111th Congress. Okay. And one more for now. We'll come back to finish the others. So you got to jump down to question 3. And question 3 is the best description of the statutes at large is. Read carefully because there's slight differences in the answers. Wave at me when you're done. Okay, I see Susan's done. Steve's done. Okay. In the back. Left-hand side, I have very apathetic waivers here. Okay. All right, so let's go to results. You've had your chance. Okay. So a little bit more of a split, which I sort of suspected because this is the question that tripped a few people up in the screencast also. So the best descriptions of the statutes at large is, and again, the majority of you are quite correct, the official source for public laws, it is organized chronologically. Again, the statutes at large is where you find public laws, and it's just organized chronologically for the volume that came around. You'll see it's got 1974 on it, volume 88. So again, public laws are published just chronologically as they're passed. Public Law 115.1 probably covers a very different topic than Public Law 115-2, and very different than 115-3, and they're just going to be put in the statutes at large in that order. I don't know what volume number it'll be, but again, chronologically. So I don't want to single anybody out, but for those of you who are a little confused, if you have questions, now's the time, or whenever, ask. Whenever you are so moved, please ask if you still have questions. Okay, I don't see any. So we've been talking about sections that get put into the U.S. Code. Let's actually take a look, and let's assign me out, friends. So we'll sign back in, we'll show it. There we go. Okay, and there's... So now I'm going to show you what it looks like from the other end, from the U.S. Code. So as we already saw in Statutes at Large, Section 514 of Public Law 93-406 wound up in Title 29, the labor title of the U.S. Code. And maybe, there we go, Lexis will bring us there. There we go, yay. So what we're going to do to see it on the other side is here on today. In the U.S. Code on Lexis, as you can see, section 1144, I'm going to go to history. And in history, what you will see, shock of shocks, is, check it out, PL 93406. I bet you're all so surprised. So what the history is telling us of section 1144, this is section 1144 as it exists pretty much today. What the history is telling us is the history. Actually, Lexis has a good name for it. It's telling us, so section 1144 was initially added to the code by Public Law 93406. It was enacted into law in 1974, and section 1144 we will find in Title I of Public Law 406, Subtitle B, Part 5, Section 514, just like we saw back when we were looking at 93406. And you will find Public Law 93406 in volume 88. Remember, we were looking at the Statutes at Large, volume 88. Stat stands for Statutes at Large. Now, this number is slightly different. It's not 829, it's 897. That's because if you look back on your handout, Section 514 is actually on page 897. You don't need to worry about that level of detail, but just so you understand what we're looking at. And it's important because what this history is telling us is not only when it was enacted, but when it was amended. So it's important to understand how this is read. So you would read this just as I described, 93406 and all the information, and then I see a semicolon. You've heard in the law that punctuation can be really important. Here's an example. I see the semicolon in history, and I say to myself, and amended by, and then I say, okay, it's and amended by Public Law 97473, which was enacted in 1983. Within Public Law 97473, Section 301 and 302, that Public Law 97473, I can find that 96 statutes at large and the particular section I'm interested in, 2611, and actually probably also 2613. So I see the semicolon, and I know this seems a little silly, but I'm going to ask you all to say it with me. So I see the semicolon, and we say, and amended by, right? Everybody? I know, it's silly. Bear with me. So, and amended by Public Law 98-397, enacted 1984, Section 104 within that public law, and we find it in Statutes at Large 98, and we find that particular section 1436. So I see the semicolon, and what does that mean?
Amended by.
Okay. So, and amended by what? Public Law 272, sorry, misspoke, enacted 1986, Section 9503, and within Stat 100, Volume 100, Statute at Large, that section on 207. And one more time with feeling, semicolon, and amended by. Okay, this time it's your turn. And amended by what?
PL 101 to 39.
139, and it was enacted when? 1989, and which section of Public Law 101 to 39? 7894 and all that stuff after? Are you following it? I know it might be a little hard to read, but are you following the logic? Okay. Okay, so question.
When you're saying it's amended by, so like, is it just amending one element of that total thing and not just the whole thing? You know what I'm saying?
It's amending some part of Section 1144.
Okay.
We don't know what part is until we look at that section in that public law.
Okay.
So each of these public laws might have amended the same text, or it might have amended different parts of 1144.
Okay.
We don't know that till we look at it.
Okay.
Okay, so question for you. It's not a trick question, but it's not an easy one either. What was the last time our section 1144 was amended? By what public law and what year? Speak up.
Public law 102.
So the very last time this section has been amended was just the very last public law listed in the history. Public Law 109-280 in 2006 by this particular section in 109-280, and here's where we'll find that section in the statutes at large. Okay, so you all understand how to read the history, and this is the history of the text of section 1144. We'll talk, when we talk about legislative history, we'll talk about how to figure out a little bit what was changed in 1144 by these different public laws. But for now, you just need to understand what this is telling us in terms of amending this particular section. Any questions? Okay. So in the screencast, we took a look at something called the Table 3 tool. And the reason we took a look at the Table 3 tool in the screencast, and we're going to do it again, well, two reasons. One, it's a great illustration of how the sections change, how they get transferred. So here's the Table 3 tool. By the way, all these links that we're looking at that are not within Lexis or Westlaw or Bloomberg when we get there are on the course website in class web links. So if you want to get back to the Table 3 tool, you can do it there. You could also just Google House, because it's from the House of Representatives, Table 3 tool, and that'll probably get you there too if you remember that name. But if you don't, come back to the course website. So the Table 3 tool will tell us, is basically what I call the translation table between the public law section and the U.S. Code section. And the way you use it is you need to know the year and the public law number. And of course, once you know the public law number, you can figure out the year by looking at the Congress number and then figuring out the year. But we won't make it more difficult than necessary. So we know our public law was passed in 1974, and we know it's good old 93-406. 408, 07, there's 406. And there it is. Can you see past me?
Yeah, I just looked on the side.
Okay.
Thank you.
And can you see, Wendy, can you see past me? Okay. So the table sets out for us the division, I think, in a pretty clear way. So here's 93-406. Here's our public law. Here is the act. So in other words, the act of the public law enacted, ERISA. So here are the numbers of the act. So as we already saw when we looked at it, Section 2 was put in Title 29 of the U.S. Code. You see the U.S. Code up here, Title 29, Section 1001. Section 3, Title 29, 1002. If we scroll down a little, what we discover, as we saw when we looked at the public law, a little bit later on, this subsection 111, the subsection of Section 111 of the public law was actually put in a totally different title, Title 18. Probably it has to do with some criminal provision, because Title 18 is Crimes and Criminal Procedure. If we knew we were interested in 514, we could scroll down and see, sure enough, it goes into Title 29 of the U.S. Code, Section 1144, as we've already talked about. And just to make the point hopefully clearer, again, these later sections, 1015, 1016, wound up in Title 26 of the U.S. Code, the Internal Revenue Code or tax title of the U.S. Code. What I am emphasizing is that this section numbering of the public law is totally different than the section number where it winds up in the U.S. Code. And you might be wondering to yourself, okay, that's really nice and geeky. Why do I care? One reason you care, there are several reasons. One reason you care is that, once I sign back into Lexis.
Can you say that one more time? The section number of the public law is totally different than the section number of the act itself.
The section number of the public law, which is the act.
Yeah.
Public law 93, 406 is Employee Retirement Income Security Act.
Yeah.
So Public Law Act are synonymous. So the Public Law, the Act, the section number of the Public Law or the Act is totally different than where it gets codified, where it gets put in the U.S. Code. So one reason you care is that you will see references. So I am looking at the New York Times from January 24th, 2017, so a couple of weeks ago. And it is talking about a Supreme Court rejecting an appeal regarding a Texas law enacted in 2011 having to do with, and here it is, Section 5 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. So you will see references to the Act. Public, translate in your mind, public law. Good question, by the way. You will see references to the section of the Act or the public law. You will see it in the general media. You will see it in legal news. You will see it in cases. You will see it in other statutes. How many of you anybody take securities? How many times have you heard references to the 33 Act or the 34 Act? Am I right? Okay, good, good. So you're getting section references to the Act. You don't really, most of the time, want to know what the Act said in 1933 or 34. You want to know what that section is today, right? Likewise, the Supreme Court. They don't really want to know what the Voting Rights Act said when it first passed sometime in the 1960s. The Supreme Court is interpreting the Voting Rights Act as it exists when they made this decision. And they're looking at the Texas law from 2011. So obviously they're not thinking about the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s and what it meant then. They're looking to what it means today as applied to this Texas law that was enacted in 2011. And I can tell you anecdotally from experience sitting at the reference desk, I very frequently get attorneys coming in wanting to view a particular section, and that's the information they have. And they go to the U.S. Code and they say, I don't know where to find this. And then they come to me and I explain to them that they need to translate from the Act or public law number to the code. And the way to do that is our good friend, the Table 3 tool. So what you need to do that is that all-important public law number. Because as you saw, once you know the year and the all-important public law number, you just kind of go through 3 or 4 clicks and voila, you are there. So let's do this. Except there's one other piece of information we need, right? Let's go back to the, glad you agree. So what piece of information do we need? We know Section 5 of the Federal Voting Rights Act. What are we missing? Public law number. What do we have? Section and well, we don't have the year yet. We have the name. So what would we wish for? Well, we wish for the all-important public law number, but we have the name. Wouldn't it be nice to have a table that translated the name to public law number? Of course there is one. See, you guys already know half of this. There is something called the popular name tool. Again, at the house, so again, link is on the course website, or you can Google House Popular Name Tool. And it's just an alphabetical listing of popular names. Now, I will say as an aside, yes, you can also Google it. And a lot of times you will succeed very well. If you Googled ERISA, public law, you would actually pull up a very nice Wikipedia entry that has, in fact, the accurate public law number. Probably the same for Voting Rights Act. Actually, I haven't tried it recently. So that's fine. But it doesn't always work. Or you might pull up something that's totally confusing and have to go through links and links and links on Google. And I don't know about you, I don't have that kind of time to waste trying to figure out Google when it doesn't work easily and quickly. So I'm happy to know about the popular name tool. So just as I said, an alphabetical listing. We can scroll down to V, or we can hopefully Control F will let me do it. And there you see I've already typed in Voting Rights Act. And then I'm just going to arrow down Okay, so we don't want Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks Acts, these first three entries, so I'm going to keep on going. Overseas Citizens Voting Rights Act, not what we want. Aha, Voting Rights Act amendments. They didn't say amendments in that article, so here are a couple of amendments. Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we learned the year, and sure enough, what's our public law number? Sorry.
Oh, that's fine.
Say that again? 89110, and actually this popular name tool tells us where to find it in the US Code, except it doesn't tell us the specific section. So we could just go to the US Code and flip through, or we could go to our good friend, the translation table, the Table 3 tool. So 89110, 1965. We now have our information. So I'm just going to go back to the beginning of the tool. So 1965 is there. And 89110, right? Is that right? Okay. And section 5 is where in the US Code? What's the other piece of information you need in the US Code? 52 is what? Title, and then section. Everybody see that? Here's section 5 of the Act of our public law. Section 5. Here's title of the US Code. Title 52, section 10304. So you see how that works? Okay. So let's go back and to our poll questions and see how well all of this makes sense. So we've done questions 1, 2, 3. Let's go back to review questions again on the side and look at question 4. And question 4, while you're navigating there, asks, if you have the name of an act, for example, the Affordable Care Act, what is the best way to find it in the US Code? So the name of an act, Affordable Care Act, best way to find it in the US Code. Ready? Okay. I got maybe a little too fast for a couple of you. Sorry about that. So if you have the name of an act, so the key word there is name of act. Best way to find it in the code is the popular name table or tool. It's called either one. Best to Google popular name tool because that's how it appears on the page. So again, you don't want to look in the statutes at large for the section in the US Code. You want to look in the US Code. Make sense? For those of you who didn't quite get there, I'll go a little slower for the next one. Okay, so that was question 4. Now we're going to go up here to question 5. I know the ordering's a little confusing there. So once again, if you have the name of an act, for example, the Affordable Care Act, what is the best way to find its public law number? Look up, wave when you're done. I love this. Okay. All right, again, popular name table or tool. Again, you'll find that act in the statutes at large, but when you want to look in the US Code for as it exists today, currently, that's where you need to go. Okay, we're going to get a little trickier now. Not a trick question, but just more difficult. So I shouldn't say tricky, I should say difficult. But you guys are good. I'm confident you can handle it. Okay, so question, we're on 6. Yep. Getting myself confused with the ordering. Thank you for that. Question 6. Yeah, this one's a little, 7's easier. Okay, so I'm asking you to go to the popular name tool. I gave you the link. You can copy and paste that and put it in another tab, or if you want to Google it, whatever. And I'm asking you to find the public law number for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. A little more work on your part when you're done. Okay, just about everybody. Is it like that thing in the back of a car? Minute.
Should have followed the United States code on Twitter. That's awesome. It's so sick.
Okay. All right. So those who answered, excellent.
It was good. Y'all updating the popular name.
Anybody, for the couple of people, I guess I went a little fast again. So again, just popular name table, find Civil Rights Act of 1964, and you'll find it there. Okay, just a couple more of these. We'll move on. So let's go to 7. As I said, this one's a little easier. So question 7. The section number you are interested in is section 2 of the public law. Then it will be numbered section 2 in the U.S. Code, true or false? 50% chance. Wave when you're done. Okay. Ooh, two-handed wave, like it.
Someone's going to.
Okay. Someone wanted to put in true. I don't know if you're just having fun or you're confused. But there's one person who just... I noticed that in the screencast too. I had some clearly erroneous answers that a couple of people picked. So I'm going to just assume you were having a little fun. Since I put in the silly answers, I suppose I deserve the answer. So fair enough. Okay, but more importantly, you understand again the numbering is totally different. So you see Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is not going to be Section 5 in the U.S. Code. Okay, last but not least, a little challenging. Question 8. So now I'm asking you to go to the translation table, the Table 3 tool, and I give you the link. So open up another tab, however you want to do it, and find what the U.S. Code section is for Section 1563A of Public Law 111-148, which was enacted in 2010. So go to the Table 3 tool and find that section, the U.S. Code site for that section. 111-148 is the public law number. Yep. So section 1563A of Public Law 111-148 is what we're looking for. When you're done. Okay. Early birds. So again, if you can remember the name, you can Google House Table 3 tool or House Popular Name tool. Link in the...
Don't ask me why. I'm just
Okay.
curious. Really?
Okay, again. Excellent. Any questions? So we've looked at our hero, the public law, up close and personal. We have a sense of the numbering system. We understand that the numbers get totally changed as it's put into the various titles of the U.S. Code. So let's get to know the U.S. Code. So on page 14 of the walkthrough handout, and actually going back just to give us the big picture first, and then we'll dive into the details. Back here in our sources handout, under our legislative heading, you see subject compilation of legislation, again, currently in force, equals code. So you will find the statutes as they currently exist, arranged by subject in the United States Code, and also in the United States Code Annotated and United States Code Service, and I will be explaining the differences between those three shortly. But let's first get to know the United States Code, which again is the official version. And what you will see here on page 14 is the title page of the 2012 edition of the United States Code. So the United States Code in its official version has a really odd publishing scheme. So here in Hein Online, and I'm just choosing Hein Online because it's easy to show. If we go to the U.S. Code, so as I mentioned when we talked about law reviews, Hein Online has lots of other good stuff, and some of that good stuff is the U.S. Code. So going to take a look at the U.S. Code on Hein, and again having to log in again. So here in the U.S. Code. The U.S. Code, the official version, is published every 6 years. I have no idea why 6 years. But you can see here on Hein going back every 6 years to when the U.S. Code first started in its, as it exists now in 1925, it used to be published in something called the Revised Code. And if you need to go back that far and look at a statute that had existed prior to 1925, go ask a reference librarian, because it's probably not something most of you will ever need to worry about. But do know that it's updated every 6 years, and the reason you need to know that is that the U.S. Code in its official form, published by the government, isn't really up to date. So I just clicked on the 2012 edition, and as you saw on the prior screen, that was the most recent, and scrolling down here past all the titles, you eventually get to, well, you can, for those of you interested in the popular name table and the translation tables in print, they exist in the U.S. Code if you want to come find them. Why you would want to do that when it's easy to find them on the web, I don't know, but up to you. So what happens with the U.S. Code? Obviously, laws change within those 6-year publication dates. So supplements are published. So you can see supplement number 1, 2013, supplement number 2, and a couple of volumes in 2014, actually 3 volumes in 2014 and then 2015. You turn to page, so you'll notice on page 14 in print, and I do have my show and tell. So here is the 2012 edition for the title we're interested in, Title 29. And we're looking at the title page on page 14. On page 15, we see the title page of Supplement 2 that covers between January 2013 and January 2015. So it is a cumulative supplement and takes us through January 15. And that's essentially what I am pointing to here on the screen on Hein Online. You'll notice that there is one later supplement that goes to January 16. So the best we can possibly do is a year ago, but actually it's not even that good for what we want, because as you will see, as I scroll down, volume that goes to January 3rd, 2016 only covers titles 1 to 19. We, of course, want title 29. It's just how the U.S. Code is published. They publish by title number for some strange, unknown reason. So the earlier titles get updated sooner than the later titles. So the best we can do for title 29 is what we're looking at on page 15, which is supplement 2, which is up to date as of 2 years ago. So, if you want to look at the U.S. Code as it exists today, and of course today is 2017, the official version of the U.S. Code is not the best place. I know you journal folks love to cite to the U.S. Code because it's official. So, but you need to ask yourselves, does it matter that it's 2 years old? And I leave that up to you, that's editorial decision. Although, I think you can kind of tell what I think the answer should be, but we won't go there. Okay. So that is why we want to get to know the U.S. Code Annotated and the U.S. Code Service, because those are, again, commercially published versions of the U.S. Code that are far more up to date, even in their print version and most definitely in their online versions. Oh, so I forgot to do show and tell. Here's supplement 2 of the U.S. Code, the official. Okay, so one thing, oddly enough, we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on is how to find statutes. Of course, this is a research class. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And the reason for that is we've kind of already done it. Again, if you are going online, Lexis, Westlaw, Bloomberg, you already know how to use the filters. If you just want to search the U.S. Code, you know how to do a keyword search. If you want to search everything and then narrow by the filters to get to the U.S. Code. So I don't think we need to review that. We already saw the popular name table. If you actually have the name of the act, probably not in most cases when you're trying to find the law on whether HMO can be liable or fill in the blank of any other issue. Most likely in terms of you finding the appropriate section or sections of statutes, whether it's U.S. Code or state, you are going to resort to secondary sources, just as we have already done. So I mentioned this earlier. As you may remember, one of the many sources we looked at, and I know I didn't give you much opportunity to read them, so you might not have gotten all the details of the references to primary law, but here this ALR article that we saw actually in our first or second class referred us directly to 29 USC 1144, somewhere in a footnote as it talked about ERISA. And again, in some of the treatises we saw, in some of the law review articles they referred us at the very least to this section and actually probably to other sections. So here, preemption clause, and sure enough, as it's talking about that. So statutes are, I'm not saying never just dive into the U.S. Code and do a keyword search, but you're much more likely to be effective and successful if you get some background in an area, especially an area you're not familiar with. Once you start practicing for a while, you're going to get familiar with an area and you're going to know, oh yeah, I need to go right here in the code. But till that point, again, secondary sources are really going to be your best avenue to discover what sections of the code are useful. Because the other thing you discover, if I gave you the time to read the secondary sources that we found, is that there are actually a couple of other sections in Title 29 of the U.S. Code that might be useful, 1132, for instance. Again, if, not in this AL article, but in the treatises and the law review articles, you would have seen reference to that as well. So the other place you might want to try, and I've been thinking about some of the questions that you've been asking in the screencasts in terms of how do you find effective search terms? especially if you don't know anything about an area, you don't know what words there are to search. So you don't know about to search the word preemption. Again, secondary sources is one answer, but even sometimes finding those relevant secondary sources. And I've been thinking about those questions. I'm beginning to think that indexes are more useful than I have been giving them credit for. Tables of contents also definitely, but I've given tables of contents lots of credit, but also indexes. Because online and print, personally, I don't really like indexes online. I'm showing you online because that way you can all see it. I find jumping around a little confusing, but if it works for you, great. Print online, that's not the important question. The important point is to remember the index as a tool, especially if you're struggling for search terms and you're doing searches and not getting anything relevant. Here, if you go to the US Code on Westlaw, you will find the index. You can actually do a term search of the index. As I said, I find navigating indexes online a little bit clunky, but if it works for you or not, go to the books. We obviously have the indexes, which, again, I find better. The point being, again, scroll through, scan through, flip through an index to give you some ideas. Because what I'm realizing is happening is we do the keyword search, and this happened with when we searched ALR and the other secondary sources, is you get a whole list of results, and they're all just bunched in there together, and you see your search terms and they look attractive, but they're not categorized for you. And if you don't know much about an area, you may think one is pretty relevant, and you may not realize the other is pretty relevant. But if you go in an index that's categorized for you, that's created by an intelligent human being who's decided, oh, look, liability of third-party payor is healthcare payor is actually really relevant to HMOs. They are HMOs. So if you had gone to an index online and print, you would have gone HMO, you would have gotten directly to this particular ALR article in a couple of minutes. So another way to find statutes, again, secondary sources, in my opinion, the best way, indexes, either code index or, again, go back to your secondary source indexes if you're having trouble identifying search terms. But what I want to focus on now for pretty much the rest of today is the U.S. Code Annotated and the U.S. Code Service. They are known as annotated codes. Get it? USCA, U.S. Code Annotated, and it's USCS Service just because annotated was already taken. Those are the competing publications by Lexis and Westlaw. They are called annotated because they have additional features other than just the text of the statutes. In the U.S. Code, we find the text of the various statutes. In the USCA and USCS, we find lots of other really, really useful stuff. So my theme for the rest of today is annotated codes are your very best friend. And I am hopefully going to convince you of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go what I call bimodal, and I'm going to look at Westlaw on the screen, and we're going to look at what the U.S. Code Annotated looks like in print. The reason for that is there are a lot of people who still prefer using codes in print. It's just how they're arranged, and again, just the flipping back and forth and going back and forth the screens. If you've got different sections in different books, you can open and have them open at the same time. A little more difficult to do that on the screen. So there are a lot of people, librarians, very high-tech, computer literate people who still like to use the print. So I want you to make that choice for yourself and understand how to use both. So let's go back to our section on Westlaw. And we will look at why annotated codes are our friends, and then we'll take a quick look at Lexis and Bloomberg, but the only reason it's a quick look is because it's for Lexis, it's pretty much the same thing, it just looks a little different. Bloomberg isn't quite as good, but they have a little bit, but the concepts are basically the same. So if you understand the concept of an annotated code and why it's your very, very best friend, you can use them on any of the services and hopefully also in print. Okay. So the first thing you want to use in an annotated code, and in truth this is also in the regular unannotated US code, my very one of my very favorite tools, the table of contents. So you'll see here on Westlaw, it kind of lists where our section lives within the table of contents in this heading material. So I can go two ways in terms of looking at the table of contents. I can look in this heading material and decide what's the broadest area that applies to me. I might want to look at all of ERISA, Employee Retirement Security Program. I might want to look at protection of employee benefit rights because I know that the other titles have to do with tax, and I'm not interested in that. And you won't know ahead of time the way obviously I do, but you just click and you look. And if I didn't already know, the advantage of doing this is that here early on in subtitle A, not even our subtitle, I find that very useful definitions section. Remember, we saw that in the public law back as it existed in 1974. I want to see how it exists today. And sure enough, in section 1002, here it is. So the table of contents in statutes is totally key to effective statutory research. Put that in bold and red letters in your notes. I can't tell you how many times I have a research question and I do a keyword search in statutes. I kind of get around there, but I know it's not right. I click on the table of contents. I scroll down. There it is. Table of contents is probably one of the most useful aspects. And again, poke around. You won't necessarily go to the exact perfect section the first time. So here in subtitle B are some of the other subsections. So we notice here, now I already know so here's our 1144. So I'm going to look around 1144. I might be able to figure out civil enforcement is useful. And the reason there too is just that there are a lot of extra annotations for 1132, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So Westlaw just divided it up. And maybe I want to look at these other parts. Maybe fiduciary responsibility is interesting. Again, spend a little bit of time with the table of contents. You don't get charged for it. For those of you thinking about cost-efficient research on Westlaw, really useful tool. The other place for table of contents, a little bit more immediate, is Westlaw provides a table of contents link there, but that's just the various sections right around mine. It isn't expanded out. So again, depending on your particular subject, you may want to try both. How that looks in print is a little bit different. So starting on page 16, we see the U.S. Code annotated. And here's what the book looks like. And you know that our section 1144 is mentioned on the spine, but obviously, as you can see on the page 16, there's a range of sections. So if you were interested in 1134, you know you'd find it in this volume. And turning to page 17, you see the table of contents. And I'll tell you how to find it in print in a moment. And you'll notice, again, the same strategy concept. Take a look for sections of interest, the definition sections. Page 18, you see a couple I highlighted, obviously our section and 1132. And turning to page 19, and what you see is where in the book that's going around now, you would see section 1144. Now notice section 44, I've referred to this a couple times, but not in depth. It's called Other Laws. And then you see subsection A is supersedure, effective date. This is actually where the ERISA preemption section is stated. It doesn't use the word preemption in the text of the statute. And this is why I say keyword searching of statutes can be problematic, because the vocabulary used in statutes is very what's called controlled, very narrow, and the legislators sit down and they figured out the exact words and they hammered it out, or maybe they were deliberately vague because there was political disagreement, so if they stayed vague, everybody would, or at least enough people would have agreed to vote it into law. Any number of reasons that the language won't use the common language that we use to express these ideas. ERISA, preemption, which again is why I say secondary sources is going to be the way for complex areas for you to get into the code, the index being another tool or alternative. So on page 19, you'll see on the top I've circled chapter 18. That is how I can tell how far to flip back to find the table of contents. It's a little tricky in print to go back and find the table of contents, and sometimes I just tell people just flip back till you find it, because it's a little, as I said, it's a little tricky. But if I see chapter 18, then I would watch on the top of the pages until I can see the beginning of chapter 18, and that's how I would know the beginning of the table of contents. Okay. You see on page 19, within section 1144, there are definitions. So again, even within your section, if there are definitions, especially if you know that's your relevant section, you want to see, are they defining any of the terms that are relevant to your issue? So always good to watch out for definitions as its own section, as a subsection within a section. Okay, so turning to page 21, and I'm going to show you the equivalent on Westlaw. At the end of the text of the actual section, on Westlaw you see something called credits. If you look up on the screen or look on the print, does it look familiar? Anything we've seen? Pardon me? Public law. So where did we see that? History and Lexis. Actually, I think History and Lexis is a better name than credits on Westlaw. So just kind of hopefully put in your head, Westlaw has a weird name and they call it credits. This is the exact same information. So of course we know that our section was enacted by good old public law, our hero 93406. And then of course we see the semicolon and say to ourselves, and amended by everybody?
And amended
I know it's silly, but hopefully when you get this, you will see this question in your assignment. When you get your statutes assignment, you will need to know how to read this. So I'm hopefully helping you out with your assignment here. Okay, you see the public law number, and I won't go through it again. We did that successfully once, I see. In the handout, so you can see what it looks like in print on page 21. You'll see it's not called anything. It's just parentheses and then a whole bunch of public law numbers. It's after the text of the actual text of the statute section. Okay, so here's where the annotated code starts to be your very best friend. And it exists in print and online. Online, we see context and analysis. And what context and analysis are secondary sources to help you understand what on earth this section is saying. It's basically secondary sources. So for whatever reason, you start out and you get yourself to 29 USC 1144, but you have no, what's other laws and supersedure? And I'm worried about liabilities of HMO. Here you have law reviews, other library ALR, encyclopedias. We'll talk about forms later on, and treatises. So our good friends, all the secondary sources we spent the last few weeks talking about. How that looks in print, if you take a look, actually turn to page 23, and you see the same. I mean, this is the same publication. It existed in print long before Westlaw existed online, and all Westlaw did is put it online and then make it usable. So just paging through pages 23, you'll see references to encyclopedias, references to ALR. On page 25, I highlight just scanning through one ALR. If I were scanning through this in the paper, when I was like, oh, that might be useful. Treatises, I mean, basically what we just saw over here on Westlaw. Really useful sources, again, to help you understand what on earth this, and this is specific to section 1144. So unlike our secondary source research where we had to narrow our searches and figure out Boolean terms maybe, or figure out if it's relevant, or go to an index, if for whatever reason we already made it to 1144, we could get help understanding it. Another useful source, we'll talk about citing references in a variety of different contexts, and we'll be talking about administrative law and regulations later on this semester, but you can also get hopefully a sense of some of the regulations that were promulgated with having to do with this statute section, section 1144. You see a link to regulations. Some of you may have noticed earlier on when we were looking through the various secondary source references on page 23, way in the beginning of all those references, there was a promulgation of regulations section, so you could get a sense of what regulations have to do with this issue that 1144, our section, covers. Now, honestly, these references to regulations aren't the best, in my opinion, because they frequently send you off into tangents that have nothing to do with your issue, but it's not bad to write. It's right there. Take a look and see if it helps. If they're irrelevant, they're irrelevant. You got to go do something else, but if they help, then hooray. Okay, any questions about annotated codes so far in terms of secondary source and regulation references? Okay, now we get to the good stuff. This is why we, the library, one of the reasons we pay lots of money for Lexis and Westlaw. This is why firms, organizations pay lots of money for Lexis and Westlaw. Yes, it's in the books too, and we'll take a look at the pages in a moment. Actually, let's take a look at the pages first, because I think that will make Westlaw make more sense. And we pay lots and lots of money for the books that are going around because of the notes of decisions. We're lawyers. We read cases, right? You read case before the first day of law school, right? And been reading them probably almost every day, hopefully with a little break since then. So there are cases that interpret statute sections. Just like if our case goes to court and there's a written decision about the liability of HMOs, this will be a case that somehow interprets section 1144 and possibly 1132 and maybe some other sections as well. Yes, you could do case law research the way you've always done them by going to Westlaw Lexis and plugging in key terms and seeing what comes up. But why not have it narrowed to the statute section that you know is at issue if you indeed have a statutory issue? That's what notes of decision does. So looking at page 28, after all the cross-references and secondary source references, you see notes of decision. And what we're looking at on the beginning of on page 28, again we'll look at Westlaw in a moment, are the topics that these decisions discuss having to do with 1144. Remember, this is all about section 1144. And any statute section you look at, the notes of decisions are all about that statute section. So all of these different topics within 1144. So if you turn the page to page 29, hey, look, there's a topic just about health maintenance organization. So I can find cases that interpret 1144, that discuss 1144, that involve health maintenance organizations. How perfect is that? And that number 192 will help me find it in the book. But of course, there may be more than one, especially in a complex area like this. So on page 30, you'll see another topic, negligence towards state regulation or control. Remember, we talked a little bit, is this a negligence issue? Can we find somehow that the administrator at the HMO might be negligent? And that's topic number 238. What do those numbers do for us exactly? Well, if you keep on turning the pages, you'll eventually get to 192. Notice on page 31 up top, I have that handy-dandy arrow pointing you to that little note 192. If you flip the pages and watch up top there, you'll get to 192. And sure enough, down at the bottom, another handy-dandy arrow. Here are the annotations, the summaries of cases that have to do with health maintenance organizations with regard to our section 1144. So here's a description of the first case here. And turning the page to page 32, you see the description, a few sentences about the case, and then you see the citation to the case. So your annotated code has done your case research for you. Not all of it. You got to do some on your own, but it got you started and possibly a good way into it. And look at all the cases. Now, obviously, probably not all of them are relevant, but it narrows the whole world of cases to you to cases talking about 1144 with regard to health maintenance organizations. And all you had to do was flip the pages and know about notes of decisions. And, of course, go to your best friend, the annotated code. Okay, let's take a look on Westlaw. Super duper easy. There's a tab, Notes of Decisions. How nice is that? And it works pretty much the same way. These topics are the topics we saw that, again, discuss 1144. And you can scroll down and just browse them. So you actually look, here's one, ERISA preemption. Of course, this is online on Westlaw, so there are other things we can do. So here in the list view, we can actually search notes of decision. Now here, as in all cases, but so few of us do this, but just a reminder, it's worthwhile, read the directions, because it tells us use /P to search for all terms in a note. So remember, these notes, let's actually look back on page 32. These are just notes, 3 or 4 sentences at most about a particular case. Obviously, you have to read the case. But it's not the decision. So what we're searching on Westlaw are just these notes. And in fact, I should highlight, because I didn't do so earlier, whatever you read in the secondary source, however fabulous it is, that ALR article is great, we found some great treatises, some good law review articles, you have to read the statute section. And not just part A, supersedure. You got to read the whole thing, because you don't know it yet, so you don't know where there might be something relevant. I know it sounds like I'm stating the obvious, but a lot of people in their rush to get things done say, oh, that guy knows what he's talking about, he's an expert, I'm just going to rely on the law review article. Don't. You got to read the statute section, you got to read the case. Okay, so we're seeing these several sentences about the case. We can search those notes, those several sentences about the case, but we need to read and realize we have to use our /P connector. So if we were interested in, let's see, search terms we've been using, denial, /P, care, and I'll say /P, so I want all of these together, just, I'll be greedy, health, maintenance, and actually that's all I'm going to search, because I'm searching just a couple of sentences, so health maintenance should be enough. You could type in organization too. And so what Westlaw is doing is pulling all those case summaries out, and excuse me, so it turns out, not surprisingly, those case summaries appear in these topics of the notes of decision. Here's 192, right? That makes sense. It's going to be in that number we already discovered. And if I click on them, and that little number next to it tells me there are 2 cases, and sure enough, so here they are, health maintenance and denial of care. So most importantly, you understand just how valuable notes of decisions are. Check the notes of decisions. If you get the searching techniques, fabulous tool, another tool to put in that toolbox. But the important part is looking at the notes of decisions and understanding that the topics will really help you narrow in. Because there's some sections like 1144 that have a whole lots of notes of decisions. You're not going to want to read however many hundred there are. Any questions about notes of decisions? Okay, let's take a look at Lexis and Bloomberg, because they also have annotated codes. And actually, Lexis not only has an annotated code online, but Lexis is kind of the other guys. Hertz and Avis, right? Do they still do that? So this is the Avis of the U.S. Code, the other guys, U.S. Code Service. And I say that because most organizations you go to that have a print code these days, and I think larger firms and organizations probably still will, they most likely have the United States Code annotated, the red book that went over. That's actually right here. My round is right here. This is a competitor, Some places have this. Variety of reasons why they might go with one over the other, but this is far more prevalent. But this is what the U.S. Code Service looks like. And it's an annotated code. It does pretty much the same things. The content will be different, as I will show you in a moment. So 1144, we already saw that. So again, it looks a little different. So if we wanted to go to the table of contents, again, we could click on one of the links in the heading as we decided which was the broadest that was relevant to us. Or we can go to the table of contents here on the side. We already saw the history, so we don't need to go there. We have research references and practice. That's essentially the context and analysis equivalent. And here's one of the big differences between the two codes. U.S. Code Annotated is going to have West publications, surprise, surprise, and obviously U.S. Code Service will have Lexis publications. So the references will be quite different. Not entirely, because you see they both do Amateur, but they will be largely different. Still valuable. Okay, the other thing Lexis has is that fabulous notes of decisions, but of course they're competitors, so they have to call it something different. They call it case notes. And works just the same way. You've got your topics. I know it looks a little different. You've got your topic listing. The topic names are going to be different because this is Lexis, not Westlaw. So you can see scrolling down. Doesn't really look like they have a search facility for the case notes the way you can on Westlaw. I'm going to double check with our Lexis rep about that. I haven't seen that, but they're always changing and expanding. But you always have Control F. So that's notes of decisions on Lexis. And then briefly on Bloomberg, here's section 1144. Bloomberg doesn't really give us research references, context, and analysis. Basically, Bloomberg doesn't give us secondary sources that discuss 1144. Bloomberg will give us what they are now calling smart code, which are essentially, again, the case notes. Notes of decisions. Any questions so far about annotated codes and why they are our very best friends for statutory research? So are we finished? We've looked at everything we need to look at if we're looking at our statute section? I'm asking you. Good heavens, no. We have to update, and update. No. Update. Thank you for being my plan. Actually, we didn't plan that ahead, but appreciate that. You gave me a chance to bang the table with vehemence. So, how are we going to update, and update? And yes, we have to do it online as well as in print. Notice this little yellow flag here. I'm going to go back to document. We want to pay attention to these little yellow flags in statutes as much as we want to in cases. These are our key cite signals, and we use key cite in statutes and shepherds in statutes just as we do for cases. So obviously it's telling us here that there's a case that found something unconstitutional. We probably want to take a look at that. And then there's proposed legislation. So if it's proposed legislation, we don't really have to worry about it changing what exists today. It might change later if this proposed legislation ever gets passed. Most proposed legislation doesn't, by the way. Most bills don't wind up becoming public laws. But we can see, oh look, in the 115th Congress, here was something that was introduced having something to do with 1144. Again, don't have to worry about it in terms of changing what exists today, but good to know if we're following this issue. If there were an actual change in a public law that didn't get incorporated yet, Westlaw would have a red flag and it would put you into the public law that changed it. But as we saw, remember, looking at our credits/history, the last time 1144 was changed was 2006. Looking at what that looks like in print. Don't know if you all remember from first year having to check the pocket part. Here's my volume here. Remember this funky thing, soft bound thing in the back? Yeah.
Does that get updated like on a
Annually.
Yeah, okay.
So
just refer that part out.
So yep, library staff takes this out and puts the new one in. You get a whole pile of them in for the USCA and for the USCS and other sets that have pocket parts. Yep. Hey, back in the day when everything was in print, there was a lot more. So yes, remember to check the pocket part if you are using print. And as Mariella points out, it's not up to date as much as it is online. So you want to be aware, again, remember bibliographic awareness of that as well. So let's see what that looks like. If I can find, there's my handout. So on page 33, you'll see what the pocket part looks like of the volume. So it doesn't really tell us how up to date it is. We see the library stamp, but so we know the library got it in June, but that doesn't tell us how up to date the information is. So you're just basically looking at the print at the moment. We just don't know. But more importantly, going to page 34, what the pocket part is telling us, when we turn in the pocket part to our relevant section, 1144, we don't see any text of the statute. What we see immediately are law reviews and journals, so references to secondary sources, and then notes of decisions. So that means is that when this pocket part was printed, whenever that was, there were no updates. But we can get updated notes of decisions, which might be useful, and updated secondary sources. And sure enough, if we turn to page 35, the number that we identified, 192, as being interesting health maintenance organizations, there's some more recent cases. So checking, again, if you're using the print, checking the pocket part, even though there are no updated text of the statutes. Now, in terms of updating online, as I mentioned, you've got the flags to let you know if there have been any changes in the public law. What Westlaw and Lexis will also do is it will let you know how current the information, the USCA information is, or in Lexis, the USCS. You'll notice this little link, currentness, right below the section number. What this is telling us is that Westlaw has updated the U.S. Code Annotated current through this particular public law number, 114-254. Now, you might remember the public laws went up to something like, in the 114th Congress, which went to December, they went up to something like 359. And no, I don't expect you to remember that or go back and forth to public law lists. You just get a sense here of how up to date. At some point, these numbers will start to read 115, because of course we're now in the 115th Congress. Actually, this makes more sense, I think, on Lexis. And the reason for that, other than, let's go back here to history. So back to what we were looking at. Oh, actually, no, I want to go back to the top of the document. So here on Lexis, what Lexis does is, again, right under the section number, it actually just tells us nice and easily, current through this particular public law number, 114-327, and the date it was approved. And again, this is when Lexis last updated the U.S. Code. Likewise, the currentness link on Westlaw. Let me find it, sorry about that. This currentness link, when it was last updated on Westlaw. Students get confused. I think probably a lot of people get confused between the difference between when Section 1144 was last updated by Congress. Remember that was by Public Law 109-280 in 2006. And when Westlaw last updated the U.S. Code. Think of the difference being last amended. Remember our and amended by? So last amended is when the text of the section was last amended or changed. Last updated is when Westlaw last changed the U.S. Code. And likewise on Lexis. When Lexis last changed the U.S. Code, the history is again when Congress last amended Section 1144. Again, this is a question I will ask you on the assignment, so make sure that you are clear on the difference. And if you're not, ask either today or when you decide later on, wait a minute, I thought I got it, but now I don't. Okay, there are no questions. We will talk about the other features of using Keysight and Shepard's. And actually, you'll see Shepard's on Lexis just so see what it looks like. Let's go back up to the top. You would see a signal. If you Shepardized, you would see, again, an updated signal if there was a change in the public law that Lexis hadn't incorporated. We'll talk more about Shepard's and Keysight for statutes next week. A couple of highlights I want to mention regarding statutes, and then we have just enough time, hopefully, for a workshop. So things to remember about statutes. We're looking at ERISA preemption, somewhat coincidentally, because preemption is also a concept you want to keep in mind about statutes when you're thinking about federal statutes versus state statutes. A lot of federal statutes that are passed that basically say, states, we're doing the work on this, don't you bother, because whatever we say rules. And there might be some separation of powers questions or 10th or 11th Amendment questions about that. But think about the concept generally, as well as the fact that we're talking about ERISA preemption throughout the course. Obviously, statutes are authoritative only in their jurisdiction, and unlike cases, not really persuasive between states. So what New York has to say on a particular issue in its statutes doesn't really affect New Jersey or California or Texas or anywhere else. Maybe other states will look at each other and say, oh, well, that's kind of a good idea. Maybe we'll try it. But that's about as far as it goes. So you're not going to argue in front of a court or represent in a memo, well, New Jersey does this, so it kind of is important if you're in New York. There are something called uniform and model laws. You've talked about them already in your various classes. The UCC, I'm sure you've talked about in contracts, and the Model Penal Code. These are model laws developed by very august, respected legal groups, the American Law Institute amongst them. We'll talk about why we care about them and how to find them next time. But they are, as the name suggests, models or uniform. They are created as a suggestion to say, hey, states, take a look at this and do it this way, because we think, all these wonderful, very expert people, very smart professors and practitioners took a look at this, and this is what we figured out makes sense. As a uniform commercial code, as a model penal code, there's one for wills. They're all over. There are a whole bunch of them, like a whole bunch of them. Again, we'll talk about that next week in a little bit more detail. If you know you're starting with a statutory issue, you're either, whoever gives you the research assignment says, this is a statutory issue. I know the statute is somewhere in the labor code. I think they'll be a little more specific than that, but start with the statutes or start with secondary sources and then go to the statutes. It amazes me